Before I began my curatorial career, I worked on the entrance desk at Tate Britain. And aside from directing people to the bathroom or to the toilet or telling them that there wasn't any other Damien Hirst on display, I was frequently pointing them to this painting, which is Ophelia, of course, by Sir John Everett Millais, which was painted in 1850 and exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1852. The sad madness and death of Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet was a favourite subject for the group of British artists who called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and who formed in 1848 with the desire to reject the formulas of beauty and old-fashioned subjects taught at their art school, the Royal Academy, and pursue more realistic styles and stories relevant to modern life. Pre-Raphaelitism was a movement that was just as much concerned with English literature as it was concerned with fine arts, and the Brotherhood frequently depicted Shakespearean subjects. Shakespeare was particularly admired. He was second on their list of immortals, which was a list of both artistic, contemporary and modern heroes who the Brotherhood perceived to be the most influential and important. Shakespeare was only tipped to the top prize by Jesus Christ. Now today this painting is also Tate Britain's best-selling postcard, indicating the popularity of the work. And if you go to Tate Britain today, you'll see a 10-foot image of the banner outside of the gallery. They clearly know that it brings visitors in. When I worked at the gallery, I had the misfortune of telling a visitor that the painting wasn't on display because it was currently in Moscow. And believe it or not, she actually burst into tears. And then when I told my colleagues about this unfortunate thing, they weren't surprised at all. Apparently it happens all the time. Indeed, one only has to type Millais, Ophelia into Google and pages of content turn up. Recently, the Telegraph published an article which was top 10 things you didn't know about Ophelia. And indeed, a Twitter poll declared recently it was the nation's favourite painting. And also, I recently typed into Instagram #Ophelia, and what did I find accompanying photographs of the painting? #MyBestGirl, #Ophelia. Another, cried at the Tate Britain tonight, #Ophelia. Another, never felt like this before, #Ophelia, #feelings. And finally, my favourite, best painting of all time, in it, #Ophelia. The fact that this painting brings visitors to tears and that the postcard decorates desk-side tables around the world highlights the enduring influence of Millais' painting. But we must first acknowledge the fact that this is an image of a dying young woman who's been driven to suicide by the key male figures in the play. What is it about this disturbing realisation of Ophelia that earns it the title of the nation's favourite painting? Especially given that 19th century critics called it grotesque and accused Millais of painting a milkmaid in a frolic. There were 55 paintings of Ophelia exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts in the 19th century. There were more paintings of Ophelia than any other Shakespearean heroine. So why is it that this particular image of Ophelia, of a drowning Ophelia, is so famous today? Well, in order to understand why Millais' interpretation of Ophelia is so iconic, we must first have a very quick look at other 19th century paintings of Ophelia and the critical responses that these received. Upstairs on level 3 of this museum, in room 67, is this painting of Ophelia by Arthur Hughes. Hughes was not an official member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but his style and subject matter intersected with that of Millais and Rossetti and William Holman Hunt. This beautiful but relatively small work on panel is actually a sketch of a larger painting completed by the artist over 10 years later and now housed in Ohio. Hughes' completed full-length figure of a mature and lush Ophelia depicts the Shakespearean heroine with long flowing red hair and piercing blue eyes. She is gathering flowers to hang on the willow tree. The daisies in her hand symbolise innocence. The violets around her wrists symbolise faithfulness. However, the poppies gathered in her arm symbolise death. and here Hughes has chosen to depict Ophelia moments before she slips into the brook and drowns. 19th century critics thought the painting was elegant and most beautiful. Here Ophelia's idealised beauty pleased them. This work at first seems strikingly different to Hughes's earlier version of Ophelia, painted when he was just 19 years old and exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1852. And many of you will recognise this because it's currently at Manchester Art Gallery and is usually on permanent display. This earlier work shows a dark swampy woodland setting, and Ophelia, again with a sorrowful expression, is seated in the centre on the base of an overhanging willow tree. She's a delicate, pale young girl with long fair hair and is dressed in a virginal white dress with a crown of reeds and flowers on her head. Indeed, feminist scholars have called her Tinkerbell Ophelia. However, as with the painting here at the Ashmolean, it presents Ophelia as a lovelorn, innocent young woman, beset by grief and disappointment in love. Here the viewer pities her. Critics found the painting attractive. They approved of this sentimental image of an innocent, waif-like Ophelia. And though we don't have time to look at every image of Ophelia reproduced in the 19th century, what is obvious is that there was a stereotype. Images of Ophelia emphasised her madness and melancholy, which was understood by Victorians to be part of female nature and was linked very closely to the female body. This stereotype manifests itself in visual culture as a distracted, innocent young woman in white, her hair down, clutching garlands of wildflowers. However, enter the 23-year-old John Everett Millais, who exhibited his painting at the same Royal Academy exhibition in 1852. Millais was already well known in the Royal Academy because he was the youngest student to join the art school, and indeed in his earlier years at the art school they knew him as the child. His painting of Ophelia received a more prominent hanging position at the Royal Academy, and despite only being a little larger than Hughes's painting, his work overshadowed it and came to dominate critical conversation. He'd chosen to depict a scene from Hamlet that was usually cut from Victorian performances, and the deleted scene I refer to is of course Gertrude's famous monologue, which detailed Ophelia's death from drowning, and which also was presumably cut from 19th century Victorian performances because it too compromised Ophelia's conventional innocence. And if you bear with me one moment, I'll be able to play this scene for you. The Pre-Raphaelites were fired with a passion for painting the truth, and here Millais has paid homage to Shakespeare with his truth to the text. He has chosen to privilege Shakespeare's words over the theatrical production, and has made a literal realisation, in paint, of the lines where Ophelia's gown is heavy with drink and about to pull her down to muddy death, which you would have heard had it had worked. Again, in truth to Shakespeare's text, Ophelia is portrayed not in the virginal white as we have previously seen, but in a silver embroidered gown that Millais bought from a second-hand shop for £4, which is the equivalent of £250 roughly today, because he believed it captured the fashions of the ancient age in which Hamlet was set. So intent was Millais on depicting Ophelia drowning in the brook that he asked Lizzie Siddal, who is of course Rossetti's famous muse and future wife, to pose in a bath kept warm by the heated lamps underneath. And of course many of you know the story that Lizzie actually caught pneumonia because Millais was so intent on painting her that he forgot that the bath had turned ice cold. And he ended up paying about £3,000 in today's equivalent of medical fees. Anyway, this painting largely horrified critics in the 19th century. And one observer, when viewing both paintings in the 1852 exhibition, wrote, "Hughes shows us the art to which this title has been given may be made attractive, just as others seem to have laboured only for the purpose of showing its repulsiveness." Given my introductory comments about the painting, repulsive is probably not the word that we would use to describe this painting today. However, many were deeply troubled by Millais' work, and they were deeply troubled by the fact that he had chose to portray a dying Ophelia. Indeed, the 15 paintings of Ophelia exhibited at the Royal Academy between the beginning of the 19th century and 1852 had all represented Ophelia in painted form, despite the fact that she only appears alive in 5 scenes of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the longest of the Shakespeare plays. Previous pictorial representations of Ophelia assume that the audience had prior knowledge of her looming demise. These images appeal to the viewer's sense of pathos by encouraging them to contemplate Ophelia's madness and fragility. In depicting her actual death instead of her madness, Ophelia was unable to act as a visual template for natural female melancholy and sentimental attitudes towards death. Instead, audiences would have associated the drowning Ophelia with the contemporary and controversial myth of the fallen woman. And for those of you who are unaware of what constitutes the fallen woman, let me very briefly explain. In the 19th century, the fallen woman was used to describe a woman who had fallen from respectable society by having a sexual knowledge outside of marriage. The fallen woman captured the imagination of artists, novelists, and poets who were particularly interested in the multiple repercussions that awaited a woman after her sexual and moral fall. Many of the painted depictions of fallen women show them near to or on a bridge, thus implying their literal fall as they jump in the water to commit suicide. George Cruikshank's engraving, produced 4 years before Millet's Ophelia, is one example, and it depicts a fallen woman jumping to her death. The engraving was accompanied by the lines, "The poor girl, homeless, friendless, deserted, destitute, and gin-mad, commits self-murder." Our eyes are of course drawn to the woman's falling body. However, her eyes are covered as she plunges to her death from Waterloo Bridge, a bridge that was well known at the time for illegal suicides. Her sleeves are worn and shredded, indicating her recent suffering, and a man and woman look over the parapet in alarm. George Frederick Watts's Found Drowned shows the aftermath of such suicides. Here we have the corpse of a young servant girl washed up under Waterloo Bridge. The stark and detached title of this dramatic composition refers to the legal term used in a coroner's inquest, and is perhaps indicative of the harsh attitude towards these fallen women. Emotion has instead been emphasised with an allusion to the cause of her tragic suicide, and in one hand we can see she clasps a chain and a heart-shaped box. Clear iconographic connections can be drawn between Watts's Found Drowned and Millet's Ophelia. Both are figures lying on their backs, their palms slack and open, and their clothes heavy with water. After suffering at the hands of a patriarchal society, they have both faced death. Millet's painting of a drowning Ophelia, in drawing such obvious comparisons to fallen women, could be seen to suggest that Ophelia wasn't chaste. Critics felt that successful artists who enjoyed a public reputation in the 19th century had a responsibility to uphold moral standards. For a society that placed such importance on Ophelia being a virtuous maiden, the idea that she had enjoyed a sexual relationship with Hamlet would have tainted her virtuous reputation. Millet, in making a meticulous rendition of Gertrude's speech, a speech which was widely seen by many to contain some of the most sexual imagery in the play, has drawn attention to the sexuality of Ophelia, which of course was an extremely controversial thing to do for an artist in a period where female sexuality was a social concern and where the sexual innocence of a young woman was highly valued. Those who had portrayed Ophelia previously, such as the Arthur Hughes, both of his images which I showed you earlier, these artists had not dare allude to Ophelia as anything but sexually innocent. In depicting the maiden as a poor wretch with her mouth erotically open and her clothes spread wide around her, in the eyes of the Victorian critic, Millet had compromised Ophelia's pathetic innocence and beauty. This brings me to my final point about why Millet's painting of a drowning Ophelia is so iconic. The artist painted her between June and October 1850, when he and Holman Hunt travelled to Surrey to paint, as the French say, in plein air beside the river Hogsmill. He built himself a small hut to protect his canvas and his materials from the elements, and he worked for 13 hours a day for 6 days a week, painting directly from nature in order to complete the background of the painting. As I mentioned earlier, it was important for Millet to be true to the text, but it was also a pre-Raphaelite ideal to be true to nature, which was an approach championed by the art critic and theorist John Ruskin, who encouraged the Brotherhood to go to nature, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing. Here you can see the willow that grows at Scanterbrook, which of course symbolises forsaken love. And here Millet has painted with breathtaking accuracy the nettles, daisies, and long purples, representing in that same order pain, innocence, and sexual love. And as an afternote, what I find particularly fascinating about this is that in order to achieve the bewitching brightness of colour, Millet actually would prime his canvas with a glue solution, and then he would mix it with lead white as ground, and he would then paint a layer of zinc white to make the canvas brighter. Anyway, that's just me. Anyway, this truth to nature also upset 19th century critics. He felt that the emotional significance of Ophelia's death had been hidden beneath a veneer of unnecessary detail. They accused Millet of privileging nature over Ophelia's sorrow, and of robbing the literary heroine of her emotive impact in favour of a silly pre-Raphaelite principle. Critics said that the painting would strike less painfully, not to say less awkwardly, if Millet had not focused on every petal of the darnel and anemone floating on the eddy. Throughout the play, Ophelia is referred to by her brother as the Rose of May, and she's always clutching wildflowers. She's often linked to nature. However, Millet has painted Ophelia, the flowers, and the trees without hierarchy. He has given as much prominence to the background of the painting as to Ophelia herself. In her death, Ophelia is not just placed in nature, she's been consumed by it. For Millet, this was a real testament to the pre-Raphaelite manifesto of truth to nature. For critics, they merely thought that Millet had a strangely perverse imagination which has soused Ophelia in a weedy ditch. So, to go back to the beginning, I cannot tell you why this painting brings visitors to Tate Britain and why it makes them cry, or indeed why the postcard reproduction adorns desks worldwide. Indeed, a study of Ophelia's afterlife in modern and contemporary culture would take all day to discuss. However, I hope I've enlightened you a little on why this particular painting of a drowning Ophelia stands out. Millet used a familiar and beloved subject in order to challenge mid-century Victorian ideals. Pre-Raphaelite artists were judged by their ability to portray Ophelia, and he used this beautiful image of her upstairs on level 3, which I would encourage you to go to, but actually it's closed right now, so go on another day. Millet's Ophelia was deemed attractive because, like many other representations, it merely alluded to Ophelia's death, rather than showing it actually taking place. Millet, in portraying a drowning Ophelia, an Ophelia who had transgressed sexually, and whose beauty was no more important than the nature surrounding her, transformed the Victorian stereotype of an innocent, pretty, and pitiful Shakespearean heroine to a bolder image that acknowledged both Shakespearean text and the complexities and attractions of femininity. Thank you all.